Hello guys, today we will be covering the main general topics in intestacy. We will mainly be discussing what happens to property when someone dies without a will, or when for whatever reason property does not pass through the existing will. First though, I want to talk about the characters, the players that we will be dealing with, and some vocab words for this lesson. For example, in this class in intestacy, D will stand for decedent, not defendant. The decedent is the person who has died, whose property now we're trying to distribute in accordance to the applicable intestacy statutes. But I also want you to learn to spell this because you need to differentiate it from the word descendant. As I stated, decedent is a person who dies, the main character in all of this, the person whose property we will be tested on how to distribute. Descendants are people who are born in a direct biological line. So here, A's children, grandchildren, and so on are her issue, which is the same thing as saying descendants. If this is you, these are your descendants. Your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth are your descendants. Now, let me ask you something. Are your siblings descendants? So your siblings' children, grandchildren, are they also your descendants? And the answer is no. Your siblings' descendants are not your descendants. Remember the definition. Descendants are people who are born in a direct biological line. And yes, this includes adopted children. Okay, moving on. If this is you, these are your ascendants, also known as your ancestors. Your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents are your ascendants, your ancestors. And we call it ascendants because we're ascending in line. And remember, we're talking about direct biological lines. So your uncles and aunts are not your ancestors, okay? Your ancestors are your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. Moving on, estate is all the money and property owned by a particular person, especially at death. Distribution is a payment of money or asset to a beneficiary, to an heir. And dying intestate means dying without a testamentary document, dying without a will. That's it for the vocab words, but I do want you to keep this in mind. I want you to remember the following. The intestacy statutes, the intestacy rules don't just apply to people who have died without a will. This is a very common mistake with students, and I don't want you to make this mistake. So I want you to remember that property may pass by intestate succession when obviously a decedent dies without having made a will, or a decedent's will is denied probate for whatever reason, it's invalid. Or, and this is an important one, a decedent's will does not dispose of her property entirely, either because a gift or bequest has failed, or because the will contains no residuary clause, or for whatever reason. If a decedent's will does not dispose of her property entirely, then that specific property will pass by intestate succession. And note that I did not say the entire property will pass by intestate succession. I said the specific property that is not disposed of in the will pass by intestate succession. Big difference. This means that if you have a will that disposes of 90% of the estate and does not have a residuary clause, then that 10% will pass by intestate succession. And this is very common in exams, and this is why I'm making a note of it, because a lot of people have a misconception that intestate statutes, intestate succession only applies when a person dies without a will, without a testamentary document, and that's not the case. These are the scenarios where you need to be thinking, oh, I may have to apply the intestacy statutes. And it can really be simplified with a rule. Property that does not pass by will upon the decedent's death will be distributed according to applicable intestacy statutes. All right, guys, let's dive in directly into how to do the analysis. There are steps, just follow the steps. Step 1, and this is a step that a lot of students forget to do, and I don't want you to forget this. You have to identify what jurisdiction applies over the property itself. Let me expand on this. So we need to differentiate between personal property and real property, meaning real estate, land, a house. When a person dies without a will, a decedent's personal property will pass as stipulated by the law of the state where she was domiciled at the time of her death. Whereas a decedent's real property, land, real estate, will pass based on the law of the state where the property is located. This is perfect for exams, right? And this can completely change your analysis, so always be aware, what type of property am I dealing with? Am I dealing with personal property or am I dealing with real estate, or both? Step 2 will be to determine the scenario at hand. Before you go into the type of intestacy statutes, Per Stirpes, modern Per Stirpes, Per Capita, you want to determine the scenario that you have at hand. So let's talk about most states. If the decedent is survived by a spouse and no descendants, remember, I'm not saying no children, I'm saying no descendants, the surviving spouse will inherit the entire estate. If the decedent is survived by a spouse and descendants, the surviving spouse will inherit 1/2 or 1/3 of the estate, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, and the surviving descendants inherit the rest. Now, there's a little caveat. In some states, if all the decedent's descendants are also descendants of the surviving spouse, then the surviving spouse inherits the entire estate. So if all of the decedent's children are also the children of his or her spouse, then that spouse is going to inherit the entire estate. And again, this is in some states and also UPC jurisdictions with some differences. If the decedent is not survived by a spouse and is survived by descendants, the decedent's descendants will inherit the entire estate equally. And if the decedent is not survived by a spouse or descendants, so the decedent does not have a spouse, does not have any children, grandchildren, no descendants, then the decedent's surviving parents inherit the entire estate equally. If there are no surviving parents, then the descendants of the decedent's parents will inherit the entire estate. These are the decedent's brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews. Remember, we really didn't go laterally, right? We went up and then down again. And here are the scenarios for my visual students. I created this on my iPad, so excuse it not being really professional. But for my visual students, these are the scenarios. These are the scenarios for in most states. And remember, UPC is very different. If you need the scenarios for UPC, just go to my website and they will be posted. That is the only difference, because here I'm covering most states and UPC will be posted on the website, or I will try to post it under this video as well. And then you can continue the video because I cover the distribution schemes, Per Stirpes, modern Per Stirpes, which is also Per Capita by representation, and Per Capita at each generation, which is UPC. So I am covering the UPC distribution scheme. It's called Per Capita at each generation, and that will be in the distribution schemes that I'm covering next. Okay, so let's recap. Step 1, identify what jurisdiction applies over the property itself. Remember, if it's personal property, it's going to pass as stipulated by the law of the state where the decedent was domiciled at the time of her death. And if it's real property, if it's land, if it's a house, it's going to pass based on the law of the state where that property is located. Step 2, it's going to be determining the scenario at hand. This is going to make your life so much easier when you go into the distribution schemes. So you want to know if, the decedent is survived by a spouse and no descendants, if she's survived by a spouse and descendants, and if she is not survived by a spouse but is survived by descendants and then is not survived by either spouse or descendants. Those are the 4 scenarios. They're the same for UPC, except for the fact that the distribution will be different in UPC, and you can check that in my outline, you can download it. I'm going to try to post it under this video. And now we're going to move on to step number 3, distribute in accordance with the applicable intestacy succession statutes. And yes, I do include UPC in these distribution schemes, so stay tuned. So let's begin with step 3. We're going to cover Per Stirpes, strict classic Per Stirpes, which approximately is followed by a third of the states, including Florida. Next, we're going to cover Per Capita with representation, also known as modern Per Stirpes. And this is the majority approach. Approximately half of states follow this distribution scheme. And then we're going to cover Per Capita at each generation in its minority approach, but it is the growing approach. It's also the UPC approach and the modern trend. Per Capita, just regular old-fashioned Per Capita, I'm going to just include it in the outline because it's outdated and I don't really know of any states that use strict classic Per Capita. So I am including it just in case, but I'm not going to cover it in this video. All right, so usually I see courses and books explaining the distribution schemes this way, right? For example, strict classic traditional Per Stirpes. Under this classic approach, a share passes to each child of the decedent, regardless of whether there are living takers at that level, and a deceased child's descendants take that child's share by representation. But I find it to be easier if we do a step-by-step method. So we're going to do this method step-by-step. And then I'm going to show you scenarios on my iPad so that you can see and compare. So here is my step-by-step method. It's going to be the same for all of them. Step 1 is going to be the where. We're going to determine at which generation we split the estate. Step 2 is by how many. We're determining by how many slices we split the estate. And step 3 is in which manner. For example, by representation at each generation. So these steps are going to apply to all of the distribution schemes that we look at. Let's start with Per Stirpes. So here we are, Per Stirpes, traditional strict Per Stirpes. Step 1, where? So let's determine at which generation we split the estate. With Per Stirpes, we divide the estate at the first generation comprised of either living descendants or deceased descendants with surviving descendants. We're going to look at an actual example, okay? Don't worry. After we do this, we're going to go to step 2, which is by how many. We determine by how many slices we split the estate. And with strict Per Stirpes, we split the estate between living takers and those that are dead at that very level who have living descendants. Step 3, in which manner? Well, with Per Stirpes, a deceased descendant's descendants take her share by representation. Let's see what this looks like. Let's do some examples and some scenarios using the step-by-step method for Per Stirpes. So in this case, we have a decedent with no spouse, so no surviving spouse, but does have descendants. Let's look at our steps. Step number 1 is the where. At what generation do we split the estate? And the rule for Per Stirpes says we divide the estate at the first generation comprised of either living descendants or deceased descendants with surviving descendants. So let's look. This first generation is where we split the estate, right here. Why? Because this is the first generation that is comprised of either living descendants, right here, or deceased descendants with surviving descendants. This is a deceased descendant, and this person has surviving descendants, right? So now that we've determined at which generation we split the estate, the next step is by how many. So we have to determine by how many slices we split the estate initially. So Kathy gets her share, 30K. Willis doesn't get anything because Kathy takes. Shelby gets 30K as well. And Emerson's estate gets 30K as well. Why? Because we only split the estate between living takers and the dead people who have living descendants. True, Emerson is dead, but Emerson has living descendants. So we're going to give Emerson's share 30K here, and then we're going to split it by representation, meaning 15,000 for Gina. Laura doesn't take because Gina takes. Gina's alive. And then 15,000 to Fiona's estate. Fiona's estate gets money because she has living descendants, living takers. So Helen is going to take $7,500 and Saul is going to take $7,500. We split it equally. Okay, so some students will ask me, what happens if Fiona is dead and she doesn't have any takers here, right? So no descendants for Fiona. Then this would be different. There's nobody there to take by representation. So that would make it that so that Gina gets the entire $30K by representation. Laura doesn't take because Gina is alive. And what happens if maybe only Saul is alive? And let's say that Helen is dead but has another kid, right? Charlie. Well, in that case, it would be $15K for Gina. And then Fiona's estate would take the $15K because there are people that are takers by representation. Saul would get $7,500. Helen's estate would get $7,500 because there is somebody to take there. Charlie would ultimately get the $7,500. All right, let's look at another scenario. In this case, the decedent has surviving children, $100,000 in the estate. I can do this with fractions. I'm just doing it with $100,000 or $90,000 just to make it easier. Step 1 is where? Determine at which generation we split the estate. So we're dividing the estate with Per Stirpes at the first generation comprised of either living descendants or deceased descendants with surviving descendants. So either of these suffices, okay? If B were dead and D were dead, then we still split at this generation because this generation has deceased descendants with surviving descendants. But in this case, we have both, right? We have living descendants and we have deceased descendants who also have surviving descendants. So this is the generation where we make the split. Step 2, by how many? Determine by how many slices we split the estate. With Per Stirpes, we split the estate between living takers and those who are dead but have living descendants. So in this case, we're going to split it into 4. We have a deceased descendant who has living takers, right? Has descendants. We have a live person, we have another live person, and then we have another deceased descendant who has living takers, C1, C2, and C3. And now we split the estate. In which manner? Here we do it by representation. So how does this work? B gets 1/4, right? D gets 1/4 too, another $25K. These are the living takers. And then A gets her $25K and C also gets her $25K. But this is going to be taken by representation, meaning it's going to be split equally between A1 and A2. So $12,500 each. Or if you want to do a fraction, then it would be 1/8. With C, C is also dead, so their kids are going to split this equally. So this would be 1/12, right? Each one here gets 1/12. How do I know? It's kind of easy. So if each one gets a quarter, so for example here you're getting a quarter and you're dividing it by 2. I just multiply this times 2, right? See, 1/8, 1/8. Same here. We have 1/4 where we're dividing it between 3 people. So I just kind of multiply by 3. So here we have 1/12, 1/12, 1/12. And then D1 and D2 don't take, right? Because D is taking, D's alive. And B1 doesn't take because B takes, B's alive. So B's alive, D's alive, they take their $25K. For A is dead, so A1 and A2 just split equally, right? $12,500 each, or 1/8 each. And with C is also dead, so C's surviving descendants take equally. $8,333 each, or 1/12. Some students will ask me, well, what happens if C is not only dead, but doesn't have any surviving descendants? Remember, the key here is not whether they had children or not. It's whether they are surviving. So if C is dead and doesn't have any surviving descendants, then it fails step 2. Remember, with Per Stirpes, we only split the estate between living takers, B and D, and those who are dead who have living descendants. A is dead, but has living descendants. So C would not take part. We would not split it into 4 parts. We would only split it into 3 parts. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. B1 would not take. D1 or D2 do not take, right? Because B is taking, B's alive. D's alive, takes her share, B takes her share. And what happens to A's share? A's share gets split into 2. A1 and A2 take by representation, meaning each one gets 1/6. All right, let's look at another scenario. All right, so we have a decedent, $90,000 in the estate, and this is going to be a little bit different. This is where you're going to differentiate a lot more with Per Stirpes versus modern Per Stirpes and Per Capita at each generation. So step 1 says, step 1 is the where, right? Determine at which generation we split the estate. So here, we don't have any living takers, but we do have deceased descendants with surviving descendants. So we don't have any living takers, but the rule says we divide the estate at the first generation comprised of either living descendants, which we don't have, or deceased descendants with surviving descendants. So we split the estate here because even though we don't have living takers, we don't have living descendants, we do have deceased descendants that have surviving descendants. So here is where we split the estate. That means that we're going to split it into how many? Well, let's see, step 2. By how many? We only split the estate between living takers, which we don't have, and those who are dead at that level who have living descendants. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? All of these are deceased descendants, but they all have living descendants. So $30,000 each. And now we're going to split this by representation. So for A, this 1/3 would go down to A1's pot, and ultimately A2 would get the entire $30K. B's share would be split into 2. And why 2? And why not 1 if B2 is dead? Well, because B2 might be dead but has living descendants. So B1 is going to get $15K. B5 doesn't get anything. Right? This is also the equivalent of 1/6. And B2's 1/6, B2's $15K would be split between B3 and B4. What about C's share? So C's would be split between how many? And yes, 3, because you have a living taker and you have here a deceased descendant, but that deceased descendant has living takers, has a living descendant. Same for C3. C3 has C7. So how would this go? Well, we have $30,000. So C1 is alive. She would take her 10K. C4 would not take. C2's 10K, or 1/9, right? 1/9, 1/9, 1/9. C2's 10K would go to C6. Why? Because C5 is dead and we don't see any living takers here. So C6 would get the entire 10K. of C2. And C3's 10K would go entirely to C7. So 10K here and 10K here. So as you can see, when you're taking by representation, you're just taking what your ancestor would have gotten, right? Split between also the takers at your generation. So here A2 would get an entire 30K, right? All of A's estate. With B, B's share is split between B's two children. B1 is alive, so she takes the entire 15K, the entire 1/2 of 1/3, right? Which is 1/6, by the way. And then B2, who is dead but has living takers, we're going to split this person's 15K between her two living takers. So each one gets 7,500. And again, with C, C1 is alive, so she takes all her 10K, right? Because C has 3 kids, so we're splitting it by 3. We're splitting C's 30K by 3. C2 is dead but has a living taker, C6. So C6 takes the other 10K, and C3 is also dead but has C7. So by representation, C7 takes the entire 10K that would have gone to C3. All right, now let's look at per capita by representation, also known as modern Per Stirpes. And here is my step-by-step method. Step 1, the where, determine at which generation we split the estate. With this one, we're going to divide the estate only at the first generation that has at least one living taker. This is different than Per Stirpes, where we can do either the first generation where there is one living taker or where there is a deceased descendant with surviving descendants. Here it's going to be different. We split the estate at the first generation that has at least one living taker. Step 2, by how many. So we determine by how many slices we split the estate. And with per capita by representation, also called modern Per Stirpes, we only split the estate between those that are alive, but also those who are dead with living descendants. So this part here, step 2, is the same as Per Stirpes, as traditional Per Stirpes. And step 3, in which manner? A deceased descendants take her share by representation. This part is also like traditional Per Stirpes. So let's see what this looks like. All right, we're looking at per capita by representation, also known as modern Per Stirpes. I'm starting with this last scenario that I did for Per Stirpes because this is where you will see the most marked difference, and that's in step 1. With this method, you divide the estate at the first generation that has at least one living taker. Whereas with traditional Per Stirpes, you had a choice. It was either at least one living taker or deceased descendants, so dead people, with living takers, with living descendants. So whereas with Per Stirpes, we would have split the estate here, it's not the case with modern Per Stirpes. So step 1 for modern Per Stirpes is divide the estate at the first generation that has at least one living taker. We have no living takers at this generation, so the estate will be split at this generation where we have B1 and C1 that are living takers. However, this does not mean that we only split the estate between 2. Don't make that mistake. Go to step 2. By how many? In this case, it will be the same as traditional Per Stirpes. Here, we split the estate between those who are alive and also those who are dead with living descendants. So even though we started at this generation right here because it's the first generation that actually has living descendants, we're going to split the estate differently. We're going to split it by 1. Why? Because A1, even though she's dead, has a living descendant. 2, because B1 is alive. 3, because B2 is dead but has living descendants. 4, because C1 is alive. 5, because C2 has C6 as a living descendant. And 6, because C3 has C7 as a living descendant, even though C2 and C3 are both dead. they have living descendants. Here we divide the estate between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Why? Because B1 and C1 are alive, and A1, B2, C2, and C3 are all dead but have living takers, have living descendants. So that means 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6 for C2, and 1/6 for C3. So here's a little cleaner version. So each one gets 1/6. Each one gets $15,000, right? So now let's look at how we split the estate, and this will also be the same as traditional Per Stirpes. We're going to split the estate by representation, meaning A2 gets A1's entire 1/6, so $15,000. B1 is alive, so she takes her $15K. B5 doesn't get anything right now from this decedent. Now, B2 is dead but has 2 surviving descendants, so they will take equally $7,500 and $7,500 each. C1 is alive, so C1 takes her $15K and C4 doesn't take anything at this moment. C2's $15,000, obviously C5 is dead, there's nobody to take. So they can't take by representation. Nobody under C5 can take by representation. So C6 would get the entire $15K. And with C3, same. C7 would take the entire $15K belonging to C3, the entire 1/6. Why? Because she's taking by representation. C3 is dead and C2 is also dead, right? So see how different this looks than traditional Per Stirpes. This looks so different because with traditional Per Stirpes, we started here. We split the estate here. With modern Per Stirpes, we're splitting at the first generation that has living takers. Even though we split the estate by those who are living and those who are dead with surviving descendants, we split the estate at the first generation with living takers only. So under the same scenario, what would happen if C were alive? What would happen if C were alive? So C is alive. Then we would split the estate here. Why? Because it's the first generation that has at least one living taker. And then it would really work out the same as with traditional Per Stirpes, because now we would have 30K, 30K, and 30K. So C would take her 30K. None of them would take right now from decedent. B's 30K would be split between those who are alive or dead with living takers, so between 2. 15, 15. So $7,500 for B3 and B4. Nothing for B5. And A2 would just take the entire 30K. So with this example here, the results will be the same as with traditional Per Stirpes because we have living takers in the first generation. So with traditional Per Stirpes, it would be the first generation with either living takers or deceased people with surviving descendants. With Per Capita by representation, also known as modern Per Stirpes, with what we're doing right now, we would also be starting at this same generation because it's the standard. The step 1 would be we split the estate at the first generation that has living takers. So it would be the same. So the distribution would be exactly the same as traditional Per Stirpes. So it would be 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, so 25K each. And then here, by representation is the distribution. So A's 25K would be distributed among A1 and A2. B would get her 25K. B doesn't get anything. B1 doesn't get anything. C's would be divided by 3. So remember how I just multiplied this by 3. So 1/12, 1/12, 1/12, which would also be 8,333. See, the same as with traditional Per Stirpes. Because remember, the difference between this distribution with modern Per Stirpes and traditional Per Stirpes is really the first step, is where we divide. The rest is the same. And here, D gets her 25K. D1 and D2 don't get anything because, again, D is alive, B is alive, so they take their share. And that's how it would work. So some students ask me, what would happen if B and D, which were alive in the previous example, were also dead? What happens if this entire first generation is dead? Well, then we cannot split it at this generation. Because with modern Per Stirpes, per capita by representation, we split the estate at the first generation that has living takers. So if B and D were dead, then we no longer would split the estate at this generation. We would split the estate at this generation. With this scenario here, it would also work the same as with traditional Per Stirpes because, again, the only difference between traditional Per Stirpes and modern Per Stirpes, per capita by representation, is step 1. With traditional Per Stirpes, we split the estate at the first generation that has either living takers, living descendants, or dead descendants with living takers, with living descendants. And the first step with modern Per Stirpes would be the first generation that has living descendants, living takers, right? So it would be the same. We split the estate at this generation. So this distribution here will look identical to traditional Per Stirpes. Here, Kathy gets 30K, Shelby gets 30K, right? 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Willis doesn't get anything because Kathy's alive. Shelby takes her 30K. What about Emerson's? Emerson's share would be split between Gina and Fiona's estate. Why Fiona's estate? Because we're doing the distribution by representation and there are people to take by representation for Fiona, Helen, and Saul. So Gina would get $15,000, which is also 1/6. Remember how I do this, right? If we're dividing between 2, I just multiply this by 2. 1/6. 1/6 for Fiona, right? 15,000, which will go to Helen and Saul, 7,500, 7,500. Now we're going to talk about per capita at each generation. But before we start looking at the step-by-step and then the examples, I want to show you this makeshift Venn diagram that I created because I want you to notice when we're done with these that modern Per Stirpes is really just a hybrid of traditional Per Stirpes and per capita at each generation. Modern Per Stirpes, also known as per capita by representation, shares step 2 and step 3 with traditional Per Stirpes. It also shares step 1 and step 2 with per capita at each generation. This also means that traditional Per Stirpes and per capita at each generation also share step 2. And this is going to make sense a little bit more as we go along. Let's now do the step-by-step. So with per capita at each generation, step 1 is the same as with modern Per Stirpes, per capita by representation. We divide the estate at the first generation that has at least one living taker. That's it. We don't have the choice that we have with traditional Per Stirpes, where we can divide at the first generation that has either a living taker or deceased people with living takers. Here, it's just like with modern Per Stirpes. We divide the estate at the first generation that has at least one living taker. Step 2, by how many, we only split the estate between those that are alive and also those who are dead with living descendants. The step 2 is actually something that all 3 of them share. All 3 methods share step 2. It's the same for all 3 methods. Step 3, in which manner? Here's where it gets a little tricky. Alive takers are going to take their share first, and then we pool what remains the shares of those who are dead, and then we divide it equally amongst the descendants of those who are dead. So the descendants of those who are dead are not taking by representation. Let's see what this looks like. Let's do some practice problems. Per capita at each generation, examples and scenarios. Okay, let's begin with this one. Step 1 is the where, determine at which generation we split the estate, and it's going to be the same as modern Per Stirpes, as the one that we just did, per capita by representation. First generation that has at least one living taker. So this generation is out. The first generation that has a living taker is right here, the second one. If we were doing traditional Per Stirpes, it would be this generation where we divide the estate, right? Because it says living takers or deceased descendants with living takers. So they would qualify, but that's not the case with what we're doing right now. So we're going to split the estate at this generation, right? Now, by how many? This is a step that all three methods share. We split the estate between those who are alive and also those who are dead with living descendants. So we're going to split the estate with a 1 because she has a living descendant. B1 is alive. C1 is alive. B2 has 2 living descendants. C2 has C6 and C3 has C7. So we're going to divide the estate between 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So far, it's going exactly the same as with modern Per Stirpes per capita by representation. The step 3 is the one that's different. We're not going to distribute the estate by representation. We're going to distribute it per capita. So everyone here has 1/6, right? Everyone here in this generation gets 15K. So we're first going to give the live takers their share. B1 gets her 1/6, her 15K. C1 gets her 1/6, her 15K. And after that, what remains? Okay, 90,000 minus 15 is 60,000. We're going to pool the 60,000 into 1. So after the living takers take their share, we're going to take the remaining amount, which is $60,000, and we're going to divide it equally amongst all the living takers of those who were deceased. So note, we need to exclude B5 here because B1 already took her share, and C4 doesn't get anything because C1 already took her share, right? C5 is dead. So what do we have left? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So 60,000 is going to be divided equally amongst A2, B3, B4, C6, and C7. And they're all going to get the same share. And that's $12,000. So each one of these gets $12,000. They all get the same. They're not taking by representation. Okay, let's do the scenario now. Step number 1 is divide the estate at the first generation that has living takers. So this would be this generation, right? Because we have B and we also have D, living takers. Step 2 is the same for each of these 3 distribution schemes, and we're going to divide the estate by those who are living takers and those who are deceased but have living takers. So A and C. So we're going to divide it in quarters. 1 quarter for A, 1 quarter for B. Each gets 1 quarter, which is also 25K. But now, as you remember, step 3 is going to be different. B and D, who are living takers, are going to take their share. So B takes her 25K, D gets her 25K. B1 doesn't get anything, right? Because B is alive. D1 and D2 don't take anything because D is alive. And now we're left with $50,000. If we'll pull it together, we have $50,000 because B and D each took their $25K. So how many takers do we have left? We have A's descendants and C's descendants. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So each one of them gets 10K. We pull together what remains and then we divide it equally, that's per capita, amongst the descendants of those who were deceased. All right, let's do this one. Let's look at step 1. Where do we distribute the estate? For per capita at each generation, we split the estate at the first generation that has living takers. So that would be this generation, because we have Kathy who's alive and Shelby who's alive. Step 2, we split the estate by those who are living and those who are deceased but have living descendants. So Kathy's alive, Shelby's alive, and Emerson is not alive, Emerson is dead, but has living descendants. So each one gets 1/3. $30,000 each. So now we distribute per capita at each generation. We do not distribute by representation. That means that we're going to give Kathy and Shelby $30K. Willis doesn't get anything, right? Because Kathy's alive. And what happens with Emerson's $30K? Now, here's like the tricky part. I don't want you to make this mistake. I don't want you to say, well, who's remaining? Gina's remaining, Saul and Helen, each one get $10K. That's not the case. We go down the line using the same steps. So this $30K is going to be distributed between how many people? Those who are living takers and those who are dead but have living takers. So Gina gets $15K. She's alive, so she gets her entire share. Laura doesn't take. And then Fiona's estate gets another $15K. And this $15K is going to be distributed equally amongst those who are living takers of the dead descendants. So Helen gets $7,500 and Saul gets $7,500. Now, I can see how some of you will be confused and say, wait a minute, this is very similar, if not the same, as with Per Stirpes. This looks really similar to by representation. Sometimes that's the effect, but it's not the way that we did it. So we can do another example so that you can see this in action better. Okay, let's try with this one. This is a very similar scenario, except we killed Kathy and Gina. So I want you to see how this works. Step 1, where do we split the estate? That's pretty clear by now. It's the first generation that has at least one living taker. This generation. Why? Because we have Shelby alive. Step 2, by how many slices do we split the estate? Well, we split it between those who are life takers and those who are deceased but have living descendants. Shelby's a life taker, Kathy is dead but has Willis, and Emerson is dead but has Helen, Saul, and Laura. Okay, so each get 1/3. Each gets $30,000. Step 3, we distribute per capita at each generation. This means that Shelby is going to get her 1/3. Shelby takes her $30K. And now we're going to pool the money. So we're going to get $60,000 and we're going to divide it between 3, right? Those who are living and those who have living descendants. So now that Shelby's out, we have $60,000 to distribute. That's $20,000 for Willis and then $40,000 between Fiona and Gina, right? We're going to give Willis his $20K. And now we're going to pull together Fiona and Gina's, which is $40,000. And we're going to distribute the entire $40,000, not by representation, but rather between Helen, Saul, and Laura. So at each generation, the estate is going to shrink. the living takers are going to take a piece of their pie. As you go down, as the estate shrinks, everyone in that generation that is living gets the same amount. So here, rather than Helen and Saul getting $10K each and Laura getting her $20K, which that would be the distribution by representation, per capita at each generation means that everyone in the same generation gets the same amount. The money is pooled and they get the same amount. So under the per capita at each generation approach, you're not going to have a situation where people in the same generation get different amounts. We are done with the distribution approaches. That wasn't too bad, right? We're almost done with this video, which is only part 1 of intestacy. Let's talk real quick about other heirs aside from a spouse and descendants. In most states, if the decedent is not survived by a spouse or descendants, proceed down the list until takers are found. We're going to look at surviving parents. If there are no surviving parents, then we look at the descendants of parents. So brothers and sisters and their descendants. Notice that we don't go laterally. We don't say, oh, your brother, your sister. We go up to parents, and then we look at the descendants of those parents. So brothers and sisters and their descendants. If there are no descendants of parents, 1/2 to paternal grandparents and 1/2 to maternal grandparents. Both halves to one side if there are no takers on the other side, and their descendants. So decedents' aunts, uncles, cousins. If these people don't exist, then 1/2 to the nearest kin on the maternal side and 1/2 to the nearest kin on the paternal side. All to one side if there are no kin on the other side. If none of these people exist, so failing all of the above, the estate escheats to the state. So the property escheats to the state, like the state of Florida, the state of Maryland. If it's personal property, it goes to the state where the decedent was domiciled at the time of her death. If it's real estate, then it goes to the state where the real estate is located. And that, guys, is the end of this video, the end of intestacy part 1. Check out intestacy part 2, where I'm discussing the following. I'm discussing adopted children, adoption by estoppel, and equitable adoption, non-marital children, sequence of death when death is simultaneous, so the Uniform Simultaneous Death Act and the Revised Uniform Simultaneous Death Act. We will do an example or two. I'm discussing disclaimers relating to intestacy, advancement of intestate share, and the effect of a disinheritance clause on intestate succession. Fun stuff. Stay tuned. If this is how you're feeling after this lecture, please email me at questions@jdsimplified.com. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and give the video a like.